One of my viewers, Sabah 2769, left a comment on this channel a few weeks ago that I have not been able to stop thinking about. It was not a question. It was not a debate point. It was a statement of something that has been true for decades and has almost never been said clearly enough for the rest of the world to hear it. Sabah, Malaysia's state on the northern tip of Borneo, is one of the most naturally endowed places on the surface of the earth. It has one of the world's most biodiverse rainforests. It has a coastline stretching over 1,500 kilometers along the South China Sea and the Sulu Sea. It produces approximately 40% of Malaysia's crude oil and 20% of its natural gas. Its waters contain some of the richest marine ecosystems in the Asia-Pacific. Its land sits above renewable energy potential that most countries would spend billions trying to manufacture from scratch. And yet, Sabah is Malaysia's poorest state. Not by a small margin. By a margin that should not be possible for a place with this level of natural wealth. A place that has been generating oil and gas revenue for the federal government for decades while watching infrastructure, healthcare, and development investment flow primarily in the other direction. The viewer's comment was pointing at something specific. Not just the injustice of that gap. The opportunity inside it. Because right now, in 2026, the conditions exist for Sabah to do something that no Malaysian state has done before. To take its constitutional rights, its natural assets, and the global moment we are living in, and use all three to build something that does not look like the past. Something that looks like the future. If you are new here, welcome to Shifted Perspective. This channel covers the global shifts in money, infrastructure, and power that the mainstream is too slow to see. And today we are going to Southeast Asia's most overlooked economic story. Subscribe right now so you do not miss what we cover next. Hit the like button if you had no idea Sabah produces 40% of Malaysia's crude oil while remaining the country's poorest state. And drop one word in the comments, injustice or opportunity, depending on how you read what I just said. Now let us get into it. To understand what Sabah's future could look like, you have to understand what Sabah's present actually is. And that requires going back to a document signed in 1963 that most people outside Malaysia have never read and most people inside Malaysia have spent decades arguing about. The Malaysia Agreement 1963, MA 63, is the constitutional foundation of the Malaysian Federation. When Sabah and Sarawak joined the Federation alongside Malaya and Singapore, they did not simply become states. They became founding partners with specific, negotiated, constitutionally enshrined rights that were supposed to reflect their equal status in the Union. One of the most significant of those rights sits in Articles 112C and 112D of the Federal Constitution. Sabah is entitled to receive a special grant equivalent to 40% of the net revenue of the Federation derived from Sabah. Not a discretionary grant. Not a goodwill payment. A constitutional obligation. Sabah's absolute right as a founding partner of Malaysia. For decades, that obligation was not honored in any meaningful way. The grant paid to Sabah sat at 26.7 million ringgit, a figure set in 1970 and never properly revised as Sabah's economic output grew. The gap between what Sabah was entitled to and what it actually received widened every year as oil revenues grew, as the federal government's net revenue from Sabah increased, as the lost years accumulated. Sabah kept generating. The formula kept failing it. Then two things changed. A high court ruling in Sabah affirmed what the Constitution had always said, that Articles 112C and 112D impose a binding constitutional obligation on the federal government that cannot be extinguished by administrative delay or the absence of a payment mechanism. The obligation is real. The debt is real. And as of May 2026, structured negotiations are actively underway between the Sabah state government and the federal government, focusing on four specific areas. Finalizing the calculation formula, verifying revenue data for the period from 2007 to 2025, addressing the lost years of unpaid entitlement, and designing a phased implementation mechanism for ongoing payments. The minister responsible described this process in his own words as moving forward in a structured and fact-based manner. This is not a promise. This is a legal and constitutional process with financial data already exchanged between both governments. For the first time in Sabah's history as a Malaysian state, the mechanism to unlock what it is owed is being assembled in real time. And the question that matters, the question your viewer was really asking, is not whether Sabah gets its money. It is what Sabah does with it when it does. Because here is what makes this moment different from every previous moment in Sabah's economic history. The world has changed around Sabah in ways that turn its natural assets, the ones that were always there, always visible, always valuable, into something even more significant than they were before. The global economy is undergoing the fastest energy transition in human history. Every major economy on Earth has committed to net zero targets. Japan, South Korea, Germany, the Netherlands, and Singapore are all actively looking for reliable sources of green hydrogen to power their industrial sectors through the transition. The International Energy Agency projects global green hydrogen trade reaching 260 million tons by 2050, with Asia-Pacific producers positioned to supply a significant share of that demand. Malaysia's own hydrogen economy and technology roadmap targets 12.1 billion ringgit in hydrogen revenue by 2030 and projects hydrogen contributing up to 61 billion ringgit to GDP by 2030. And Sabah is sitting on the exact combination of natural assets that green hydrogen production requires. Abundant water, geographic access to solar irradiation, offshore wind potential along its extensive coastline, the capacity to generate the renewable electricity that electrolysis, the process of splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, needs to produce green hydrogen at scale. A consortium of developers and state agencies has already announced a 10-gigawatt green hydrogen hub in Sabah, located at Borneo's northern tip. Led by property developer LBS with backing from Invest Sabah Berhad and the Sabah Forestry Development Authority, the project envisions a site covering between 15 and 30,000 acres in Kota Marudu, with an electrolyzer facility designed to produce 250,000 tons of green hydrogen annually alongside a co-located green industrial park. That is not a feasibility study. That is an announced project with land identified and investment backing already in place. But the green hydrogen opportunity is only one piece of what Sabah could build with its constitutional revenue and its natural position. Because Sabah also has something that most of the world is suddenly paying very serious attention to. An ocean. The blue economy, the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth while maintaining marine ecosystem health, is emerging as one of the defining economic sectors of the 21st century. And Sabah's 1,500-kilometer coastline, its position in the Coral Triangle, the most biodiverse marine region on Earth, and its access to both the South China Sea and the Sulu Sea give it a starting position that cannot be bought or manufactured. It has to be born into. Sabah was sustainable aquaculture that supplies high-value seafood to regional markets. Marine biotechnology drawing on the biodiversity of the Coral Triangle for pharmaceutical and research applications. Ecotourism infrastructure built around the kind of underwater environments that exist almost nowhere else on the planet. International arrivals to Sabah already surpassed 3.79 million in 2025, generating 13.7 billion ringgit in tourism revenue, a 40% jump from 2020. That is with current infrastructure. The number of what is possible with proper investment is a different conversation entirely. The Sabah Energy Commission has already set a target of 50% renewable energy capacity by 2035 through its state electricity master plan. The Pan-Borneo Highway, which will significantly reduce freight and logistics costs across the state, is in active completion phases. The PFLNG-3 floating LNG facility, carrying an estimated 4.6 billion ringgit investment, is targeting commissioning in 2027, providing a transitional energy revenue bridge as the renewable economy is built out. The pieces are not theoretical. They exist. They are funded or in active planning. What they have lacked, what every Sabah development initiative has lacked for 60 years, is the fiscal foundation that 40% of its own federal revenue would provide. And here is the part of this conversation that intellectual honesty requires. Because Sabah's potential is real. The constitutional entitlement is real. The natural assets are real. And so is the history of how those assets have been managed, and what that history means for the communities who live inside it. Sabah is Malaysia's poorest state despite generating 40% of its crude oil. That is not an accident of geography. It is the documented result of a fiscal architecture that extracted value from Sabah for decades without returning it proportionally. The communities most affected by that extraction, rural indigenous communities, coastal fishing villages, the interior populations of Kadazandusun, Bajo, Murid, and dozens of other ethnic groups whose ancestral land and waters sit above the resources that generated the revenue, are the same communities that have seen the least return from that wealth. If Sabah's constitutional revenue is unlocked and directed into green hydrogen industrial parks and ecotourism infrastructure without a deliberate plan to include those communities economically, it will simply repeat the extraction model with a green label on it. The viewer who made this comment, Sabarzanisabdin 2769, was pointing at a vision of green economic development. That vision is only meaningful if it is genuinely green. Not just in its energy source but in its economic model. If the communities who steward Sabah's forests and coastlines are equity holders in the economy that those forests and coastlines make possible, rather than bystanders to it. That is the harder version of this conversation. And it is the one that matters most. What Sabah has in front of it right now is something rare. A constitutional moment and a global moment arriving at the same time. The legal framework to unlock 60 years of owed revenue is being assembled right now in structured federal-state negotiations. The global economy is restructuring around exactly the clean energy and ocean-based assets that Sabah holds in abundance. The infrastructure foundations, the highway, the energy roadmap, the hydrogen consortium, the tourism numbers, are already in motion. And a generation of Sabahans across every community and ethnicity has united around the 40% entitlement in a way that transcends the political divisions that have historically been used to manage them. The question is not whether Sabah has what it takes to build a green economic future. The question is whether the institutions, federal and state, have the vision and the integrity to direct that future toward the people it belongs to, rather than simply toward the balance sheets of whoever is positioned to capture it first. Sabah has been the most overlooked economic story in Southeast Asia for 60 years. That is changing. And the people who understand why it is changing, and what it means for the region, for the energy transition, and for the model of resource-based development that has failed so many communities around the world, are the ones who will be able to read what comes next. This video exists because of a comment. Sabrazanisabdin 2769. This one is for you and everyone watching from Sabah right now. I want to hear from you directly. What does Sabah's green future look like from where you are standing? What is being built that the rest of the world should know about? And what is still being missed? Drop it in the comments. This channel reads every single one, and the best conversations we have ever had started exactly like this one did, with someone who knew something the rest of us needed to hear. Subscribe right now because we are going deeper into East Malaysia's economic story. I will see you in the next one.